What's up, February fellows? It is the 25th of the month, which means February is almost over and March is upon us. And if you followed my channel before, you know that every March we do Megadungeon March, where we devote March to room design, dungeon design, exploring the concept of this beloved aspect of our fantasy role-playing, dungeon crawling, and dungeons. But what is a dungeon? Before we start Megadungeon March, let's just take a look at that word, because as role players, when we think dungeon, we think strange place filled with monsters and traps and treasures that we have to go to do stuff, and then we will come back, hopefully come back from that stuff and things. But that's not what a dungeon actually is, because if you look at the definition and the origin of the word, it has very little, if nothing, to do with weird wizards or vampires or dragons or massive complexes filled with traps and treasures. A dungeon is, in fact, according to the definition on this here interweb, a dungeon is a room or cell in which prisoners are held, especially underground. Dungeons are generally associated with medieval castles, though their association with torture probably belongs more to the Renaissance period. An oubliette or bottle dungeon is a basement room which is accessible only from a hatch or hole in the high ceiling. However, the description of these basement rooms as dungeons stems from the romanticized castle studies of the 19th centuries. There is no evidence to indicate that prisoners were really lowered into dungeons using a rope. So the word dungeon comes from French donjon, which means keep, the main tower of a castle. The first recorded instance of the word in English is near the beginning of the 14th century. So basically, dungeons are a jail. It's something under a castle or near a castle or part of a castle where prisoners were kept for short times, sometimes for long times, sometimes forever. There's also the BDSM, sex dungeon thing, but we're not talking about that. We're just talking about historic dungeons. So the idea of going from a small, self-enclosed, underground, or hard to get to prison where we kept people in the Middle Ages who were, bad, according to whoever was in charge at the time, usually for tax evasion. But has nothing to do with dragons or vampires or, treasure or stuff. So how we went from underground prison, very small, makes sense. Somebody would build this place to put people we don't like, to vast caverns filled with vampires. Who knows? Who knows? In fiction, dungeons or dungeon crawls are common in modern fantasy literature related to tabletop and video games. The most famous examples is the various Dungeons and Dragons mediums. It's usually described a labyrinthian complex rather than the prison or tortured chairs, but it seems that they using dungeons in fiction started around the 19th century in Gothic novels, like the Count of Monte Cristo. But yeah, so somehow, probably just because Dungeons and Dragons sounds good as opposed to dragons and jail. So that's probably the origins of the word and how we've just taken that word to describe our vast understanding of these mythical places where things are going to happen to us. But, a dungeon doesn't have to always be just a hole in the ground. It's just basically, there are two types of dungeon. There is your linear dungeon, which is your typical dungeon that most fantasy scenarios revolve around. And it's basically any small, self-enclosed environment with very few entrances, very few exits, where the DM pretty much controls what's going to happen based upon what you do. It's not always just a hole in the ground. I mean, the Death Star is a dungeon. There's really only, if you look at it from Star Wars, there's really only one way in, one way out, there's only a few options that Luke and Leia and Han had, and things happened to them, but it's not like they could have just gone wandering around in infinite directions because the Death Star had limits. A towering building on fire is a dungeon. A space station is a dungeon. Anything that is a small, self-enclosed environment where the DM, the storyteller, can direct the action and the players have limited choices. Really, a dungeon can be broken down, as we have seen, into 5 things. An initial encounter upon first going in with something that, basically is just going to clobber you and you can't talk your way out of. A role-playing encounter, a skill check, or trap encounter, a secondary fight, and then the climax, the treasure or the big fight or whatever. But yeah, that's pretty much it, and then you just extrapolate on that depending on how big your dungeon is. But basically, a dungeon is a small, self-contained environment that's going to tell your story. You have to go rescue the princess. You have to go kill the vampire. You have to find the magic sandwich and use it later on. Then there are the Megadungeons. The Megadungeons are usually defined by being very big, often ridiculously big, as opposed to maybe having 5, 10, 15 rooms. In what you might find in a normal dungeon, a Megadungeon might have hundreds of rooms. Secondly, Megadungeons tend to be non-linear. I mean, you do kind of want themes and a story and sort of a reason for people to be there, but because they're so big and they've been around for so long, there can be ridiculous stuff in there that makes no sense. Giant talking statues that sing, Bohemian Rhapsody, crashed spaceships, gambling parlors, links to other dimensions, underground museums, the warehouses of an experimenting wizard who's been manipulating people for hundreds of years. And then, of course, whatever the actual reason for the Megadungeon to exist. Who built it? Why did it build it? Why has it been there so long? And what is the story? While a dungeon tends to be linear and have a beginning, middle, and end, and very little replay value. I mean, once you've cleared out the vampire castle and taken all the stuff, unless you're planning on living there, why do you really need to go back? But as opposed to a Megadungeon, which is constantly changing, constantly evolving, everything the players do in it changes it and changes the story. So a room that once had, 10 goblins in it, you might come back to that room in a few weeks and find that when the goblins are now dead, something else has moved in. So Megadungeons are much more living, much more changeable, much more. Players don't really know what to expect. The story, whatever it is open, much more fluid. And there's a lot more stuff going on in a Megadungeon. And there's a lot more empty space in a Megadungeon because you have this vast complex. So this March, as always, as we did last year and the year before, we're going to do Megadungeon March. Through a series of videos and whatever, we're going to design and build and maybe even put up online our dungeon. So the first thing we get to come up with is the theme for this year's dungeon. Last year was a sunken city, and the year before that was a dwarven library. So what will this year's theme for the Megadungeon be? Post it down below. Let me know what you would like to see me to explore, what concepts of dungeon building and dungeon running you want to talk about during the month of March, and I will talk to you later, losers.